Class, one of the first things that you're going to need to have an understanding of is the difference between parametric and non-parametric tests. This is going to be a foundational concept that we are going to talk about a lot in this class. And I wanted to make this recording so you had something to go back on to watch as many times as you need to get a handle on this. So you'll notice every week that we look at two statistical tests. And one of those tests is going to be considered a parametric test, and one will be considered a non-parametric test. And the difference between those two, they will both get you the same sort of answer, but a parametric test is considered a more robust test. It is a test that provides you with a finer level of detail than the non-parametric test will. So if you think about measuring the heights of people, you might, let's say if you're going to measure the height of all adults in Great Falls, Montana, if you measured all of those heights and rounded them to the nearest inch, you would get a much finer level of detail than if you measured the heights of all of the adults in Great Falls, Montana, and rounded them to the nearest foot. And that's one of the ways that I like to think about the difference between the parametric and the non-parametric test. The parametric is going to give you a finer level of detail. And because of that, the parametric test is the one that we always want to use. But it's important to know that you have to look at what you know about your data in order to make your choice of whether or not you're going to use the parametric test or whether or not you'll use the non-parametric test. And when I say what you know about the data, we're primarily going to be looking at 4 characteristics in this class. And some of them you'll learn from running the descriptive characteristics of your data set. So the first thing you're going to look at is, do you have normal or abnormal distribution? What we're talking about here is the bell curve. Normal distribution looks similar to a bell curve, whereas abnormal would not look so much like a bell curve. And what we're talking about is, is it higher in the middle and tailing off on the ends? That's what a normal-ish distribution would look like. A second thing we'll look at is variance. And I'm going to explain a little bit about this more in a minute, but variance talks about like how spread out your data is. So when you've got it plotted on a histogram, is it really high and narrow, or is it really spread out and kind of flat? That's what we're talking about with variance. A third thing you'll consider is the type of variable, and that's something else we'll be looking at in other materials in this course, but if you've got interval or ratio variables, those will lead themselves towards the parametric tests. And then the last thing we're going to look at possibly is sample size, because sometimes sample size has an impact on whether or not you will choose parametric or non-parametric. One of the ways that I've started describing this to my students is thinking about casting votes, because it's really easy for us to want to look at any one of these items as a deal breaker and say, well, we don't have perfectly normal distribution, so we must choose non-parametric. But when you start looking at real world research, you're going to see a lot more nuanced choices, I think is the best way to think about it. And so I've started to describe this in terms of casting votes. And so again, this will make more sense when you start working on it, but I want you to have this video to fall back on. When you are doing projects for this class, you are always going to have at least two groups of data to compare. So when you run your descriptive statistics, let's say you're starting with distribution, you're going to have two histograms to compare. And the first thing you're going to look at is, do you have normal distribution or abnormal distribution? And you'll have two histograms to look at. So as far as I'm concerned, that's two votes you can cast. So if you've got two that look normal-ish, you know, they have a greater grouping in the middle and they kind of tail off at the ends, then to me that would be two votes for a parametric test. But you can split. That can be a split of 1 and 1 if you want to. Second thing that I would like you to look at is, again, the variance. And this time you're going to compare the two histograms. And if you've got two of them that are really tall and really narrow, then we would call those equal-ish. If you've got two of them that are real short and really spread out, we would also consider those equal-ish. And if you've got one that's short and spread out, and if you've got one that's tall and skinny, we would not consider those equal-ish. Now, in this case, you've got two votes to cast, but you have to cast them in the same category. So if you think they are equal-ish, you're going to cast two votes for parametric. If you think they are not equal-ish, you're going to cast two votes for non-parametric. Okay, then you're going to look for the type of variable. And again, generally speaking, if you've got interval data or ratio data, you would cast a vote for parametric. If you've got nominal data, that's another discussion. If you've got ordinal data, that would go for non-parametric. And then sample size is going to vary based on each test you talk about, and that'll become a part of every discussion when we go through each test to talk about what the sample size is. But depending on that, it will indicate to you which way you should cast your votes. Where I'm going with this vote casting thing is, when you get to the end of looking at these characteristics, then you're going to need to look at the votes that you've cast and then draw a conclusion based on those votes. There really aren't going to be, in terms of this class, deal breakers like you might have seen when you went through math class, when you went through statistics class. You've got the ability to do a lot more interpreting, which is why when you do the homework every week, we ask you, which test did you think is the right test? And then we ask you what your reasoning is. So even if you choose a test that we would not have chosen, if you use this as your reasoning, the things I've just spoken about here, then we will give you the points for that because we know that you are looking at the right sorts of things. Again, we will be covering this extensively. We will be reviewing it every week. It will be a part of the discussion. So feel free to reach out with any questions you might have.